There's something magical about water. Half fluid, half light, it dazzles and beguiles the senses. Water is the fourth element of the ancients, yet it seems somehow mysterious and unknowable, distorting light and creating fogs and impenetrable mists. In Scotland, we're surrounded by water, and sometimes it seems we have too much of the stuff. Our plentiful rain fills thousands of lochs, from the tiny Lochs on our moors to the great lochs of the coast and the highlands. All have a story to tell. In this programme, my loch-hopping journey across Scotland reaches the quiet lochs of the Borders, explores the lochs of Scotland's capital, and crosses over the Forth to discover the forgotten lochs of Fife. Along the way, I'll encounter the legacy of the Ettrick Shepherd and walk in the haunted footsteps of Mary, Queen of Scots. My journey begins on the Loch of the Lows, crosses the Morfoot Hills and the lochs that provide Edinburgh with drinking water, heads to the city and over the Forth to Fife, ending on an island in Loch Leven. Between the folds of Border Hills are two tiny lochs, the Loch of the Lows and St Mary's Loch, which takes its name from a church dedicated to St Mary. These watery twins have inspired writers for centuries. Coming ashore, I'm walking in the footsteps of literary giants. In the early 19th century, James Hogg and Sir Walter Scott made the area famous in their works. This monument was erected to the memory of James Hogg, the most famous man to have come from the shores of St Mary's Loch. Now here it says, James Hogg, the Ettrick Shepherd, and the statue shows Hogg in full shepherd's garb, with a stout stick in one hand, a plaid over his shoulder, and his faithful collie dog at his feet. But in his left hand, he's holding a manuscript which says, he taught the wandering winds to sing. And that's a clue to his fame, because although he was a shepherd, he built a formidable reputation for himself as a man of letters. Hogg's most influential work is the private memoirs and confessions of a justified sinner. It tells the extraordinary tale of a religious zealot who has an evil double who urges him to kill his own brother. It's a dark tale of murder, madness, religion and death, and is said to prefigure Stevenson's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And it really is a significant achievement for a man with little or no formal education who spent much of his working life as a shepherd. Although sheep farming has declined since Hogg's day, it's still an important part of the local economy. To find out how shepherding is faring in modern times, I'm leaving St Mary's Loch for a farm in the Misty Hills. So misty, in fact, they've almost completely disappeared. Julie Hill is a shepherdess, one of just a handful in the whole of the UK, and she runs a school for sheepdogs where she hopes to teach me a trick or two.
This is my old retired dog called Ban.
He's retired?
He's retired, so he'll be slow enough for you to teach you.
Sadly, there's no improvement in the weather as we head out to begin my lesson. Tell you what, Julie, the fog's come down, I can hardly see the sheep.
Oh, just
lost in the mist.
This time they're lost. Ban, come here. Ban.
Julie quickly gets to work, instructing me on the basics.
To teach a dog, we put a certain little pressure. In other words, if I point to you, you feel a bit of pressure. Oh, yes. And then if I take a pressure away, then you feel more relaxed. He's focusing on the sheep just now. So if you just move into his space, he should leave, because you're the alpha dog now.
Right, okay. So I'll do my best.
So if you don't want him to go to the left, you put your hand that way, so he goes that
other way. Ah.
Do you see what I mean? So
yep, I think I've got it.
Okay. But you don't put your hand back there because that blocks him again. So you just, you just put your hand to say don't go there.
This is like patting your head and rubbing your stomach.
Using the techniques of pointing and moving into his space, I tried to get Ban to drive the flock into a small sheepfold. It's a skill that James Hogg, the Ettrick shepherd, would have been very familiar with.
That's it, and now you see him going, that's it,
There's
good.
the sheep. That's
Steady,
it.
Ban.
Good boy, good boy.
Despite his lowly background, Hogg cultivated a myth of genius and consciously took on the mantle of Robert Burns, wanting to be seen as the successor to the bard's heaven-taught ploughman. Although lacking any heaven-taught skills myself, I find it hard to imagine how Hogg made the leap to literature.
It's totally absorbing. Because I'm trying to communicate
And
with
then
that
watch
dog
them as well.
with the limited vocabulary that I've got, and it seems to be working.
Yeah, he's listening to you.
Bang!
That's it, good.
I'm grateful for Ban's experience and superior intelligence, and he makes short work of the task in hand.
That's it, that's it.
Hey, done quite well
Look
here.
at that, look at that.
We've done
look at
quite
that.
well. Managed to get them into this pen. That's amazing. It is a wonderful thing to see a working dog performing its art, because it is an art, isn't it?
Yeah, it is an art, it is.
And you feel almost like in touch with something kind of deep and primeval going on
definitely.
here.
That's why I wanted you to actually work with Ban, because he is very close to nature, because you can feel this little undercurrent in him that any minute now he's going to explode. Because he's close to something very predatory.
Are you optimistic about the future of hill farming and the shepherding tradition?
Well, I hope it keeps alive, because it would be a great shame to lose it. There is a lot of shepherds, lost their jobs, been made redundant, and it's just a great shame, because it's a tradition that should carry on. It's a great way of life. And what would the hills be without the sheep and the shepherds?
Absolutely.
Julie is passionate about keeping the shepherding tradition alive in the Borders. For me, it's been a joy learning just a few of these ancient skills. Making my way north over the Morfoot Hills, I head for my next destination, Gladhouse Reservoir. This loch was created in 1879 by damming the River South Esk and flooding the valley and several farms to provide a water supply for the growing city of Edinburgh, which lies just 20 kilometres to the north. Below the dam, the South Esk flows through a steep-sided wooded valley towards a village called Temple, an ancient place clothed in mystery. Everyone and their dog has heard of the wonders and mysteries of Roslin Chapel and its connection to the dark Masonic arts and the Knights Templar, but very few people realise that the centre of Templar power in the 12th century was right here in the village of Temple, when it was known by the Gaelic name Ballantradoch, the place of the warriors. These warrior monks arrived in Scotland at the invitation of King David I in 1128. They built a monastery with a tower and cloisters beside the River Esk at Temple. The only remains of the Templar power base today are a ruined church in a wooded glen by the river. The Knights were an elite fighting force, the religious stormtroopers of their day, if you like, and they saw active service in the Holy Land during the Crusades, where they were based at the ancient temple in Jerusalem, hence their name, the Knights Templar. To discover more about their presence in Scotland and their eventual demise, I'm meeting up with a local resident, Bill Brown.
So this was a really significant base for the Knights Templar?
Yes, this was the headquarters for the Knights Templar, for covering all of Scotland, interlinked with all their places all over Europe. But the Templars were getting more and more powerful, and the influence that they were exerting over the continent, and practically over half the world, was beginning to worry the Pope and the King Philip of France. So Pope Clement and King Philip conspired and thought, we're going to have to somehow suppress this organisation. And they started the operation in 1309 And in fact, the suppression finally took place in 1312.
Now, they were a very powerful, very wealthy order,
Yes.
the Knights Templar. Do we know what happened to their wealth here in Scotland when they were suppressed?
Well, that is a question. That is a question. And there's lots of rumours. Nobody really knows. But I can recall, I came here about 40 years ago, and there was an old gentleman in the village who himself must have been about 90 then. And he told me when he was a boy, there was a rumour or a legend that the treasure was buried somewhere over in around the village here. There was a hill called the Knoll, and they reckon this was a man-made hill. Now, whether it was man-made by the Templars or whoever, nobody really knows. So the question is, what's inside that hill? Again, nobody knows.
Nobody knows.
Perhaps it is, maybe it's not man-made, but that's what the legend was.
There's a lot of nobody knows.
There's a lot of nobody
yes.
knows, absolutely.
And when you've got nobody knows, that's when legends build up, isn't it?
Absolutely,
They grow.
absolutely.
Could there be treasure in the knoll? My search for it becomes a bit of a wild goose chase, but I do find another relic from Temple's rich past.
Now, this curious structure here is known locally as the Temple House Arch, and I have to say it looks really surreal just standing here in the middle of a field, a kind of gateway to nowhere, or a portal to the past perhaps. Now, local historians claim that this arch is just part of a much bigger building, a mansion house that was constructed back in the 17th century using stones that were taken from the original monastic buildings belonging to the Knights Templar. And it's an incredible thought to think that these stones that I'm touching here could well have been part of the buildings that belong to the Templar power base in Scotland. Amazing. Quite amazing.
Leaving Temple and its history of warrior monks and rumours of hidden treasure, I head north to Edinburgh, which boasts several lochs, both seen and unseen. Nestling beneath the brooding bulk of Arthur's Seat is Duddingston Loch, a truly magical and half-forgotten place in the heart of Scotland's capital city. One of the most glorious stretches of the Loch shore is Edinburgh's Hidden Garden, dedicated to a medical couple, the Doctors Neil. I've joined head gardener Claudia Potier in this lovely garden to lend a hand trimming her privet.
Now, Claudia, we're sitting in what I think is known as the Dr. Neil's garden. Who were the Doctors Neil?
They were a pair of GPs, husband and wife GP team.
A local team?
Yeah, pre-NHS was when they started, just before the NHS was set up.
Oh, really? But why did the garden here, right beside Duddingston Loch?
They originally had an allotment plot in Morningside, but it was reclaimed by the hospital over there. It needed to be turned into a car park. Same old story, same old story.
Right.
And they, from their GP list, one of their patients said, "Oh, I think there might be a plot of land that would be useful to you."
The Neils took over 2.5 acres of barren Loch shore. The transformation they wrought took 40 years, with a little help, of course.
They took people off their GP list, people that they felt needed a little bit of outdoor exercise,
Right.
maybe a little more socialisation.
Did they have a choice? You've been prescribed 6 weeks of hard labour
On our garden.
in the Neil's garden.
I think people were very happy working for them. We have our own volunteers. They're very happy to work here with us. I'm a great believer in working outdoors. It's done me the world of good all my life.
Good for body and soul.
Very good for soul, rather wearing on the body.
In these days of global warming, it's increasingly difficult to imagine what Scottish winters used to be like. They were bitterly cold, and lochs like Duddingston Loch could be frozen over for weeks or months at a time. And where there's ice, there's sport.
In a corner of the garden is a fascinating octagonal tower built in 1825 for the Duddingston Curling Society. From an upper room in the tower, members of the club could warm themselves, have a dram, and watch the progress of the curling outside. Mingling with the curlers were other winter sports enthusiasts. There was a game called ice golf, and of course, skating. Following thoughts of frozen Duddingston Loch, I've come to the National Gallery.
Skating on the Loch was immortalised in an iconic painting by the 18th century artist Henry Raeburn, but the subject he depicts is an unusual one. It shows the Reverend Walker skating purposefully and gracefully across the frozen Loch.
Sir Henry Raeburn's painting is one of my favourites. I'm meeting up with gallery curator Tricia Alliston to find out more about the man behind the skating image. It seems he had something of a double life.
The subject is the Reverend Robert Walker, who was born in Ayrshire, but as a very young boy went to live in the Netherlands, in Holland and Rotterdam, because like many Scots of this period, the links were very close with the Netherlands, but his father was minister at the Scots Kirk in Rotterdam.
Really?
So he grew up from age 5 in the north of Europe, but in a place that was very associated with skating. I mean, skating's really interesting in this period because it's a sport, but it's quite a serious sport, and it's also a socially acceptable sport. And if you belong to the Edinburgh Skating Society, which he did, it's also a sign of having arrived in society.
So it's a social status is being displayed here as much as his ability to skate.
Yeah, it's an all-round picture. It's social status, it's sporting prowess.
But there's something quite charming about it. There's something quite intimate that I want to be remembered for many things, and one of them is my love of skating, sliding around on frozen ice.
The genteel world inhabited by the skating reverend was a very different one to the world created by the pen of the Ettrick shepherd, James Hogg. Both men were well acquainted with Duddingston Loch and the slopes of Arthur's Seat, a location pivotal to Hogg's fantastical novel, The Confessions of a Justified Sinner. It was above Old Reekie where the novel's narrator met his evil double in a miasma of mist and light.
From the wild heights above Edinburgh, Hogg would have seen other doubles, straddling the Royal Mile, the Old Town, and then just to the north, the beginnings of the New Town. And during his lifetime, Hogg would have also known about Edinburgh's watery twins. To the south, the old Burgh Loch, and lapping the base of Castle Rock, the old Norloch.
There's absolutely nothing left of the Norloch today. Until it was finally drained, a dam held back the loch, which filled what is now Princess Street Gardens, stretching all the way from present-day Waverley Station in the east to St Cuthbert's Church at the far end of Princess Street. To look for evidence of this lost loch, I'm meeting up with local historian Graham Cruikshank.
Now, Graham, we're sitting here where once there was a loch, the Norloch. How was it formed?
Partly natural, partly man-made. A little burn, the Tummel Burn, ran through here, and at the far end there was a geological sill, solid sandstone. So that would have given a basis for backing up the water, and then an artificial dam was constructed, and so the valley filled up and created the Norloch.
Why was it dammed? What was the purpose behind that?
To provide Edinburgh with defence.
Well, like a moat for the castle?
Yes, a one-sided moat.
As well as acting as a defensive shield, the Norloch was used, among other things, to dunk women suspected of witchcraft. If they drowned, they were innocent. If they survived, they were deemed to have been in league with the devil and were taken away to be burned at the stake.
The water here would have been possibly less than wholesome.
That's very genteelly put. Fetid was one description. It stank, it was terribly unhealthy, very unpleasant to be ducked in, I'm sure.
What sort of stuff was coming into the loch? Was it used as a sewer or
Everything
dumping ground?
and anything. All manner of household waste, dead dogs and cats, but maybe the most unpleasant thing was offal from the slaughterhouses. And all the guts, the entrails, all the offal from the slaughtering was chucked in here as well.
During the 19th century Enlightenment, Edinburgh became a crucible of intellectual creativity. The stinking Norloch, now redundant as a defensive moat, was an unwelcome reminder of a less enlightened past. It was time for the good burghers of Edinburgh to act.
They were absolutely fed up with the stench and the pollution. So the Norloch was drained, the dam was dismantled, and although it took some decades, it was turned into attractive pleasure garden.
So this became like an Enlightenment area, part of Enlightenment Edinburgh.
It was indeed.
Intrigued to learn about the source of water that once filled the Norloch, I follow Graham to a manhole cover in the gardens.
So what have we got here? Running water, Graham.
The main body of that water is coming from the original spring that fed into this Tummel Burn, which was here before the Norloch existed, and indeed without that there wouldn't have been a Norloch.
Well, that is an amazing thought. So the water we're seeing there is in part coming from the same source that once created the Norloch.
I think that's safe to assume.
And some of the same smell.
Yes, indeed. Mind you, the nif that's coming off now is nothing like the stench that would have been the case 300 years ago at this spot.
Well, just as well they drained it then, because that really is minging.
As a kind of mirror image of the Norloch, the Burraloch once lay to the south of the castle, supplying water to the old town of Edinburgh. And like the Norloch, it too has vanished. This tree-lined path would once have been covered by the waters of the old loch. Today, it's pretty much occupied by the Meadows Park, where in former times cattle grazed the shoreline. But nowadays, there's nothing obvious to indicate that a loch ever existed here.
But there are a few clues if you know where to look for them. Now, the old loch is remembered in names like the Burraloch Walk, which crosses the meadows, Burraloch Buildings up in the Old Town, and Burraloch Lane, which at one time ran all the way down to the shores of the old loch.
Leaving Edinburgh and its twin lost lochs behind me, I'm crossing the Firth of Forth and heading to the ancient kingdom of Fife. This is Loch Gelly, which in Gaelic means the shining loch. And like other lochs on this grand tour, it too has a twin, Loch Orr, where we're meeting up with poet and playwright Willie Hershaw to look for evidence of the area's mining past.
So Willie, if we came down here to the shores of the loch, say 40, 50 years ago, it would have been a very different scene.
Yes, it was a complete eyesore. All the kind of rubbish that had been taken out with the coal had been dumped all round about.
So it would have been coal bins
Everywhere.
smoking away.
So it was very threatening post-industrial landscape, you know. There were 7 or 8 large pits, each employing 800 to 1,000 people. And of course the whole infrastructure, the shops, you know, the schools, everything like that was kind of
Everything
built
dependent
around
on
the
mining,
mines.
on
Yeah,
coal.
coal mining.
The most prominent reminder of the area's mining past is the old winding gear of the Mary Pit, standing skeleton-like above Loch Orr. In the 1930s, during the depths of the economic depression, the miners here elected a revolutionary communist, Willie Gallagher, to represent them in Westminster.
I think the Communist Party were very strong here through the miners' unions and through a number of individual people who were seen as leaders by the community. And they offered them hope. It was all about, you know, building the New Jerusalem.
And it wasn't just politics, it was education, was it not? Because this was a time when people really believed that they could control their destiny, not just through politics, but through educating themselves and having knowledge.
Indeed, and education was seen as a way of escaping the drudgery of having to go down the pit.
Among those who believed in a socialist future was local woman Jenny Lee, seen here with Prime Minister Harold Wilson. She became a Labour MP and helped to establish the Open University, giving everyone the chance to learn at the highest level. Just 6 kilometres north of Lochs is the serenely beautiful Loch One of the two principal islands is, for obvious reasons, known as Castle Island. And to get to it, I'm taking a small ferry operated by Historic Scotland.
The island I'm heading to has an ancient history dating back to at least the 13th century, but is best known as the place where Mary, Queen of Scots, was imprisoned by rebellious Scottish nobles after they defeated her in battle.
How did the Queen get to this low point? Hopping ashore, I head to the ruins that held her for a year between 1567 and 1568.
Mary's infamous and short reign was characterised by religious strife, political and sexual intrigue, and murder.
This painting shows the murder of her close friend and advisor, Rizzio, by a group of assassins led by her jealous husband, Darnley, who was later assassinated in an explosion. Powerful Protestant nobles then took up arms against Mary and defeated her in battle.
Shortly after she arrived on the island, Mary fell ill. Defeated and depressed, she was also heavily pregnant, and she took to her bed here in the Glasson Tower, where, according to eyewitness accounts, she miscarried twins.
While she was recovering from this trauma, the grief-stricken Mary was pressurised to abdicate so that her surviving infant son James could be crowned King James VI of Scotland. This doleful tale has a certain supernatural twist. Although she finally escaped from the castle, Mary left behind the bodies of her miscarried twins somewhere on the island.
Some say that Mary is looking for her babies still, and that on dark winter's nights, her ghost can be seen wandering the island, searching for their graves. All of which makes this a surprisingly haunted place for me to end my grand tour from the Loch of the Lows to Loch Leven.
My next grand tour is the last in this series, and I get lost in the landscape of the far north, travelling from Loch Hope to Sandwood Bay.
Well, with the whole planet to explore, you can literally catch up with Race Across the World, all episodes so far on BBC iPlayer. Next, an incredible edible book filled with chocolate, coconut and coffee. It's the Great British Menu.